Hey all, this is Reddit Tosker. Today we're going to be talking about the Zelda timelines. More specifically, the focus of this video will be on the Hero is Defeated timeline. We are going to talk about why it's terrible. Why it's the worst piece of lore to ever crawl out of Nintendo's addled mind. For those who don't know what I'm talking about, the Zelda series exists in a continuity that splits into 3 different timelines. This split happens in Ocarina of Time. At the end of the game, Ganondorf is sealed away, and Zelda sends Link back to the past to live out his childhood. This act creates the first 2 timelines. The world Link was sent from goes on without him, becoming the adult timeline leading to Wind Waker. The world Link is sent to becomes the child timeline that leads to Twilight Princess. And finally, there's the 3rd timeline. In the Hero is Defeated timeline, Link loses to Ganon at the end of the game. This creates an alternate timeline that leads into A Link to the Past and many of the other 2D titles. And this set of events, this 3rd timeline, is the one I take issue with. First of all, let me talk a little about the child and adult timelines, because those timelines make sense. Or at the least they make sense in the context of the games. Those timelines happen as a result of magic. Zelda magically sends Link back to the past, creating 2 parallel sets of events. You could reasonably come to the conclusion that there was a timeline split just from playing Ocarina, Wind Waker, and Twilight Princess, and many people did. There is evidence that this timeline split was intentional by the developers from the beginning. In an interview, Eiji Aonuma was asked where Twilight Princess fits in the timeline in relation to Wind Waker. This was his response. Quote, "The Wind Waker is parallel. In Ocarina of Time, Link flew 7 years in time. He beat Ganon and went back to being a kid, remember? Twilight Princess takes place in the world of Ocarina of Time, 100 and something years after the piece returned to Kid Link's time. In the last scene of Ocarina of Time, Kid Link and Zelda have a little talk, and as a consequence of that talk, their relationship with Ganon takes a whole new direction. In the middle of Twilight Princess, there's a scene showing Ganon's execution. It was decided that Ganon be executed because he'd do something outrageous if they left him be. That scene takes place several years after Ocarina of Time." End quote. That quote by Aonuma is pretty much confirmation. Aonuma makes direct reference to Twilight Princess happening in Kid Link's time, and confirms that Wind Waker happens in parallel. I've heard many people suggest that the timeline split was not initially intentional, and that Nintendo just went with theories that were already circulating in the community when they revealed their official timeline in 2011. However, I find this very unlikely, since this interview is from February 2007, only 3 months since the release of Twilight Princess, which doesn't really give Aonuma much time to lurk around GameFAQs and steal timeline theories before this interview. At the very least, this interview suggests that the timeline split was something that they had in mind while they were developing Twilight Princess. Now, let's talk about Hyrule Historia. The Hyrule Historia is a collector's book about the Legend of Zelda series. The book includes concept art, production notes, a foreword by Shigeru Miyamoto, and an afterword by Eiji Aonuma. It also contained the official timeline for the series, a timeline that was canon. This timeline reaffirmed the existence of the adult and child timelines, but it also included a 3rd timeline, one that caught a lot of people by surprise. The thing you have to understand is that this was a big deal to the people that cared about it. Zelda fans had been arguing about the timeline forever. There had always been lively discussion about where everything fits in relation to one another, or whether or not they fit at all. Many people vigorously defended the idea that the Zelda games were best interpreted as legends, that it was the same story told over and over, with the details becoming blurry over time. Even today, despite the official timeline and the official website showing the timeline, there's still quite a few that cling to that interpretation. My point is that before the official timeline, there were a lot of people that interpreted the timelines in many different ways. There was a lot of theories regarding how they worked. So the idea of there being a 3rd timeline was not really that unusual. A lot of people thought that maybe the game split off into a 3rd timeline. But the kinds of 3rd timeline theories that the community had posited were very different than what Nintendo had just put forward. Nintendo's 3rd timeline was one that no reasonable Zelda lore enthusiast would ever have proposed. It was a timeline in which Link somehow loses, and that loss creates a third timeline for reasons that are never explained. My problem with the Fallen Hero timeline is that it's not a timeline at all. It's the canonical introduction of multiverses into the Zelda series. Think about it, and think about what it means. If the timeline splits off in Ocarina, because Link loses in the final battle, then what's stopping the timelines from splitting in every final battle? How do we know there's no timeline split for every climactic battle between Link and Ganon? In fact, there's no reason for the splits to be related to Ganon at all. There's no explanation given why these splits happen. As far as we know, there's no magic involved. It's just a thing that occurs. There could be a timeline where Link loses to every boss, where he dies during the adventure, where he can't figure out a puzzle and decides to give up and leave. The first two timelines are fine. They happen for in-universe reasons. They happen because of magic. There's an explanation given for them, and it's not something that will happen all the time for no reason. But this official order of events didn't just introduce one timeline. It introduced an infinitely many timelines. It's basically like the many worlds interpretation from quantum mechanics. And it's my humble opinion that proposing an alternate series of events that creates its own separate timeline running in parallel to the other two, without offering an in-universe magical explanation to why it's happening, is stupid. Now, I think I understand why Nintendo did this. I'm just speculating, but I suspect that the Zelda series' lore and accumulated history had become too bloated. They didn't think ahead, and they wrote themselves into a corner following Ocarina of Time. The first two timelines were intentional, but they created a problem. They left no room for a link to the past. And that's not good news because Nintendo and other places had already said that Ocarina was a retelling of the imprisoning war from A Link to the Past, which means it really needed to be a sequel to Ocarina. But Ocarina already has Twilight Princess and Wind Waker. In Twilight Princess, Ganondorf is immediately captured, executed, and sent to the Twilight Realm, and is defeated soon after he escapes. In Wind Waker, Ganondorf breaks free of the seal, but the gods flood Hyrule to deny him victory. In either game, there's very little time for A Link to the Past to occur. Those two games inadvertently caused Nintendo to write A Link to the Past out of existence, and they needed a way to bring it back into the fold. And I think that their solution was this, the Fallen Hero timeline. I think it's an inelegant solution, but it's what we got. And probably what we're stuck with going forward. Thankfully, maybe it won't matter in the future. In the latest book that Nintendo made, the Creating the Champion book, also had a timeline, except that timeline only had Breath of the Wild in it. Everything that happened before was relegated to the era of myth, happening so far in the past that it didn't really matter. Personally, I think that's awesome. It solves my particular problem with it. If I don't have to look at the timeline anymore, it's not going to bother me. If they release another book after Tears of the Kingdom, and that book continues to ignore the distant past, then functionally we can just look at Breath of the Wild as the origin of a new timeline, without worrying about timeline splits or multiverses. For me, that's the ideal situation. But anyway, that's the end of this video. Please unsubscribe and unclick the bell notification. And as always, thank you very much for watching.